On a frozen February night in 1954, a Soviet colonel sat aboard a freight train rolling through the Austrian darkness. His name was Petr Deryabin. He was a decorated Soviet officer, a man who had worked in the innermost circles of Stalin's regime, a man who had stood as a personal bodyguard to the dictator himself. He was also one of the most highly trained counterintelligence officers in the Soviet Union. And on that night, he was defecting to the West. Behind him, the Soviet secret police would soon put a price on his head. A death sentence issued by the Soviet military court would follow him for the rest of his life. But ahead of him lay something the Soviets could not imagine: the opportunity to expose in unprecedented detail the inner workings of Soviet intelligence itself. This is the story of Petr Deryabin, the story of how one man's courage to defect would become the foundation of Western understanding of Soviet intelligence operations, the story of how his decision would help America win the Cold War by exposing the very machinery of totalitarian control, and the story of how the United States would use his knowledge to outmaneuver, out-innovate, and ultimately outlast the Soviet system itself. Petr Sergeyevich Deryabin was born in 1921 in the Soviet Union. He grew up during Stalin's terror, during the purges of the 1930s when millions of people vanished into the night. He was a child when Stalin was reshaping the entire nation through fear and violence. He was a teenager when the Great Terror was at its peak, when neighbors denounced neighbors, when families were torn apart by secret police in the middle of the night. He learned early what the Soviet system was capable of. He learned that power in the Soviet Union came through the security apparatus, through the secret police, through the machinery of surveillance and control. As a young man, Deryabin attended military and intelligence training. He was bright. He was capable, he was ideologically trained as a communist, and he caught the attention of the Soviet leadership. In his early 20s, he was recruited into the military counterintelligence service, SMERSH. It was a brutal organization, famous for its ruthlessness, famous for its use of torture and interrogation, and Deryabin rose through its ranks during World War II. He served on the front lines. He was wounded 4 separate times. He was decorated for his bravery. He was a genuine war hero. But Deryabin's real power came not from his military service, but from what came after. After World War II, after Soviet victory, Deryabin was transferred to the secret police apparatus, the NKVD, the MGB. These were the agencies that maintained Stalin's grip on power through terror and control. And Deryabin's career accelerated. He rose to the rank of colonel. He was given positions of increasing authority. And then, in what may have been the most significant moment of his career, he was assigned to something extraordinary: the Kremlin Guard Directorate. This was not just a bodyguard unit. This was the personal security apparatus for Stalin himself. It was an incredibly sensitive position. You didn't get assigned to Stalin's security unless you were trustworthy, capable, and absolutely loyal to the regime. Deryabin was assigned to this position in the late 1940s, and from this position he witnessed something almost no other Soviet officer ever witnessed. He witnessed Stalin in his final years. He saw Stalin's paranoia up close. He saw Stalin's decision-making process. He stood in rooms where the dictator plotted the deaths of thousands. He accompanied Stalin to major international conferences, Yalta, Tehran, Potsdam, where Stalin negotiated with Churchill and Roosevelt over the fate of Europe. From his unique position of access, Deryabin observed things that few men ever saw. He watched as Stalin planned the arrest and execution of people he had worked with for decades. He saw the extent to which Stalin had become paranoid and irrational. He understood from direct observation that the Soviet system was not a rational governing apparatus. It was a machinery of terror run by a single man who trusted no one and killed anyone he suspected of disloyalty. This knowledge would stay with him forever. In 1952 and 1953, as Stalin's health declined, political changes began to happen at the highest levels of the Soviet government. The chief architect of Soviet terror was Lavrentiy Beria. Beria was Stalin's secret police chief. He was responsible for millions of deaths. He was a man of tremendous power, but he was also a man who lived in constant fear. All top officials in Stalin's system did. Any of them could be arrested at any moment. Any of them could be executed on Stalin's whim. In March of 1953, Stalin died. Within days, there was a power struggle. Within months, Beria was arrested. Beria's arrest sent shockwaves through the entire Soviet security apparatus. Officers who had worked under him faced immediate suspicion. Men who were loyal to Beria were investigated, purged, and executed. The pattern was the same as it had always been in the Soviet system. Those who held power yesterday became targets today. And officers like Petr Deryabin, who had worked in the security apparatus during Beria's tenure, suddenly faced the prospect of being recalled to Moscow for interrogation. Recall to Moscow in the Soviet system often meant only one thing: torture, confession, and death. By 1953, Deryabin was stationed in Vienna, Austria. He was the chief of Soviet counterintelligence for the Austro-German section. It was a position of significant authority. He had access to classified files on German intelligence operations. He knew the details of Soviet efforts to penetrate Western governments. But his position also gave him something else. He was stationed outside the Soviet Union. He was in Vienna, in the Soviet occupation zone of Austria, but he was not in Moscow. And in Vienna, unlike in Moscow, there was a possibility of escape. Deryabin had other reasons to consider defection beyond the fear of purge. His marriage was unhappy. He had recently divorced. He had no family members left in the Soviet Union who could be held hostage. In the Soviet system, defecting meant condemning anyone you left behind to interrogation, torture, and possibly execution. Deryabin had calculated that he had minimal family members who would face that fate. He was, in a sense, free to make a choice that most other Soviet officers could not make. In February of 1954, Deryabin made his decision. He had become convinced that his recall to Moscow was imminent. He had become convinced that the new Soviet leadership, in their struggle for power, would use men like him as scapegoats. He had become convinced that his only hope of survival was to defect to the West. And so, on a freezing night in February 1954, he did something extraordinary. He escaped. The method of escape was audacious and desperate. He didn't try to flee to West Vienna and contact American forces directly. That would have been too obvious, too likely to fail. Instead, he left the Soviet compound. He made his way to the rail yards and climbed aboard a freight train heading towards the west, towards the American-occupied zone of Austria. It was the action of a desperate man. The freight train could have been searched. He could have been captured and brought back. He could have been shot on the spot. But the freight train was his only hope, and he took it. The train rolled through the night, carrying him towards freedom and away from the Soviet zone. When the train reached safety, when it crossed into the American-occupied zone, Deryabin revealed himself to Allied authorities. He told them who he was, a Soviet colonel, a high-ranking intelligence officer, a man who had worked in Stalin's personal security and in the KGB. The Americans immediately understood the significance. They had captured something rare and extraordinarily valuable, a top-ranking Soviet intelligence officer who was willing to defect and willing to talk. The Soviet response was swift and merciless. The Soviet Union placed a death sentence on Deryabin. They sentenced him in absentia to execution for treason. His name was added to the KGB wanted list. He became one of the most hunted men on the planet. Every Soviet intelligence service, every KGB officer, every Soviet diplomat was told, if you find Petr Deryabin, you kill him. There was no negotiation, no possibility of ransom, no option for mercy. He was a dead man walking, and the Soviets would pursue him until they found him or until he died naturally.
But for the Americans, Deryabin was gold. He was taken into protective custody. For the first 5 years after his defection, the CIA kept him in hiding. They moved him to the United States. They provided him with a new identity. They allowed him to pursue education at universities in Michigan and Virginia. But they also kept him close. They debriefed him extensively. They extracted from him every piece of information he had about Soviet intelligence operations. What Deryabin told the Americans was revolutionary. He provided detailed information about the organizational structure of the KGB and its predecessor agencies. He explained how the various directorates were organized. He explained the chain of command. He explained how intelligence operations were planned and executed. He revealed the methods used by Soviet counterintelligence to recruit agents in the West. He explained how blackmail and bribery were used to turn Western officials into Soviet assets. He detailed the interrogation techniques used by the secret police. He described the methods used for surveillance and monitoring. Perhaps most significantly, Deryabin revealed something that Western intelligence had long suspected, but never known with certainty. The Soviet Union operated a special department dedicated to political assassination. It was called the 13th Department. Its purpose was to kill enemies of the Soviet state outside Soviet borders. It was a professional murder organization operating with the approval and support of the Soviet government. Deryabin had witnessed how this organization operated. He knew the methods. He knew the targets. He knew the history of Soviet political murders. For the CIA, this information was invaluable. It allowed them to understand the true nature of the threat they faced. It wasn't just espionage. It wasn't just an ideological competition. The Soviet Union was actively engaged in systematic murder against people outside its borders. It was a state-sponsored assassination apparatus, and the CIA now knew this with certainty because a man who had worked inside it was telling them. By 1959, 5 years after his defection, the CIA decided it was time to introduce Deryabin to the American public. He testified before the United States Senate. He testified before congressional committees. He was the first major Soviet defector to give detailed public testimony about how the Soviet intelligence apparatus actually worked. His testimony was explosive. It confirmed everything that anti-communist Americans had suspected about the Soviet system. It proved that the threat was real, that the Soviet Union was engaged in systematic espionage and murder, and that only strong American resolve and superior American intelligence could counter the threat. In 1959, Deryabin also published a book. It was called A Secret World, an Autobiography. In this book, he told his personal story. He described his rise through the Soviet military and intelligence services. He described his work as Stalin's personal bodyguard. He described his observations of Stalin and Soviet leadership. He described his defection and escape. And most importantly, he described in detail the inner workings of Soviet intelligence. The book became a primary source for Western understanding of the KGB. Scholars read it, intelligence analysts read it, military strategists read it, journalists read it, American policymakers read it. Deryabin's book, combined with his congressional testimony, became the foundation for Western knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations. The CIA later assessed that Deryabin's information had damaged the Soviet intelligence effort more than any other single defector in history.
more than all the other Soviet defectors combined. After his public testimony and book publication, Deryabin remained on staff with the CIA. He continued to work as a consultant and advisor. He lectured at the Defense Ministry. He participated in intelligence training. He was called upon to validate information from other defectors. One of his most important assignments came in 1964, when another Soviet defector, Yuri Nosenko, came over to the American side. Nosenko's defection was controversial. Some people in the CIA believed he was a plant, a Soviet agent sent to spread disinformation. Deryabin was brought in to interrogate Nosenko. He spent weeks asking Nosenko detailed questions about his KGB background, his training, his assignments. Deryabin's knowledge of KGB procedures was so detailed that he could check every claim Nosenko made. When Nosenko said something that didn't align with Soviet practice, Deryabin would catch it. When Nosenko's story held up against the detailed knowledge of KGB operations, that added credibility to his information. Deryabin's interrogation sessions with Nosenko were recorded, they were transcribed, they were studied by CIA analysts for decades. His contribution to determining whether Nosenko was authentic or not was significant. In 1963, 3 months after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Deryabin wrote a secret memo to the CIA. In this memo, he theorized about possible Soviet involvement in Kennedy's death. He suggested that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who had shot Kennedy, might have been a Soviet agent. He proposed that the KGB might have dispatched Oswald to America specifically to assassinate the president. He speculated that if this were the case, it would represent the most significant Soviet political murder operation ever attempted. However, Deryabin's memo was pure speculation. He had no evidence. He knew nothing definitive about Oswald's relationship to Soviet intelligence. He was analyzing the situation based on his knowledge of how the KGB operated and what he thought they might be capable of. The memo influenced some KGB analysts, but it never became official policy. It never became accepted as fact. It was what it was, an informed speculation by a man who understood the Soviet mind and the Soviet intelligence apparatus better than almost anyone else. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Deryabin continued to work with American intelligence agencies. He was consulted on cases. He was brought in to provide expertise. He was considered one of the most valuable assets the CIA possessed. In 1973, he was even consulted by the National Security Agency as it expanded its operations. He visited Fort Meade, the NSA's headquarters. He provided insights into Soviet intelligence and Soviet military intelligence. Every interaction was classified. Every consultation was recorded. Deryabin was treated not just as a consultant, but as a living archive of Soviet intelligence knowledge. For 27 years, from 1954 to 1981, Petr Deryabin worked for the CIA. He lived under an assumed name. He was constantly aware that the KGB wanted him dead. He was constantly aware that Soviet intelligence services around the world had his photograph, had his description, and had orders to kill him if they found him. He could never travel abroad. He could never let his guard down. He lived a life of permanent hiding, even though he was living in the United States of America. But he had something the Soviets could never take away. He had his knowledge. He had his experience. He had his memories of a system that had consumed millions of lives. And he had the opportunity to share that knowledge with the American government and through his book and his testimony to the American people.
In 1981, at the age of 60, Deryabin retired from the CIA. He had given nearly 3 decades of his life to American intelligence. He had given everything he knew about Soviet operations. He had contributed to American understanding of the Soviet threat in a way that few other individuals ever could. and he had done it all while living as a hunted man, knowing that the Soviet Union wanted him dead, knowing that his former colleagues in the KGB were looking for him everywhere. In 1992, Petr Deryabin died of a stroke in Northern Virginia. He was 71 years old. He died as a free man living in the United States, having escaped the Soviet system that had once been his entire world. He died before the collapse of the Soviet Union that he had helped contribute to. He died before the world learned the full extent of Soviet crimes and Soviet intelligence operations. But he died knowing that he had made a difference. He died knowing that his decision to defect, his courage to risk everything, his willingness to work for decades with American intelligence had helped his adopted country understand and counter the Soviet threat. What is the deeper significance of Deryabin's story? It is this. The United States defeated the Soviet Union not because Americans were more brutal, not because Americans were more willing to use terror and torture, not because Americans crushed individual liberty. The United States defeated the Soviet Union because America was stronger in the ways that matter most. America was stronger intellectually. America was stronger technologically. America was stronger because we valued the individual mind, the individual genius, the individual capacity for innovation. While Soviet intelligence officials like Deryabin were perfecting the techniques of terror and control, American scientists and engineers were inventing the future. While the Soviet system was crushing individual initiative and controlling free thought, the American system was unleashing human creativity. While the Soviets were building a machinery of fear and surveillance, Americans were building the technologies that would eventually make fear and surveillance obsolete. The Soviet Union invested enormous resources into espionage operations. Soviet intelligence agencies like the KGB employed thousands of officers in an attempt to steal American secrets and infiltrate American institutions, but they were always one step behind. Because Americans didn't just copy Soviet designs or steal American plans. Americans invented better things. Americans invented faster computers. Americans invented more advanced weapons. Americans invented technologies that the Soviets couldn't match, couldn't copy, couldn't defeat. Deryabin's defection and his revelations about the KGB exposed something important to the American people. It exposed that we weren't fighting an enemy that was more advanced, more capable, or more intellectually superior. We were fighting an enemy that was brutal, systematic, and ruthless. But brutality alone cannot build a great power. Ruthlessness alone cannot create progress. The Soviet system could crush people, it could force compliance, it could instill fear, but it could not inspire the kind of free thinking and innovation that would allow it to compete with the West indefinitely. As Americans learned the details of Soviet intelligence operations through Deryabin's revelations, they also learned something about themselves. They learned that American society, with all its flaws, with all its contradictions, was fundamentally better. It was fundamentally more humane. It was fundamentally more innovative. It was fundamentally more capable of solving problems and meeting challenges. This is what made Deryabin's story so important to the American cause during the Cold War. He wasn't just revealing Soviet secrets, he was revealing the fundamental weakness of the Soviet system itself. He was showing that a system built on fear could not ultimately compete with a system built on freedom. He was showing that brutality alone, no matter how systematic, no matter how ruthless, no matter how efficient, could not ultimately defeat a system built on individual liberty and human potential.
Deryabin's decision to defect, his courage to escape on that freight train, his willingness to work for nearly 3 decades with American intelligence, these actions contributed to American victory in the Cold War. They contributed to American understanding of the Soviet threat. They contributed to American confidence that we could and would defeat the Soviet Union, and they contributed to the historical record in a way that continues to matter today. In the years since Deryabin's death, the Soviet Union has collapsed. The KGB has been reorganized into different agencies. The system that hunted Deryabin for nearly 40 years no longer exists. The death sentence that was issued against him can no longer be enforced. But his legacy remains. His books are still read. His testimony is still studied. His insights into the nature of Soviet intelligence are still relevant. Scholars still cite his work. Intelligence analysts still reference his observations. Military strategists still incorporate his lessons into their understanding of authoritarian systems. Petr Deryabin lived to see the end of the Cold War. He lived to see the vindication of everything he had believed, that the American system was stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more victorious than the Soviet system. He lived to see the world change in ways that would have been impossible under Soviet rule, and he lived knowing that he had played a part in making that change possible. The story of Petr Deryabin is the story of one man's courage to stand against tyranny. It is the story of how American values of freedom and individual liberty ultimately proved superior to Soviet values of control and uniformity. It is the story of how an ordinary man, armed with knowledge and supported by American determination, helped change the course of history. And it is a reminder that in the struggle between freedom and tyranny, freedom will always ultimately prevail, because freedom is what the human spirit naturally seeks. It is what human beings are willing to fight for. It is what human beings are willing to die for. His name was Petr Deryabin. He was a Soviet officer who became an American hero. He spent his life exposing the machinery of totalitarian control so that free people everywhere could understand the nature of the enemy they faced. He lived as a hunted man so that others could live in freedom. And his story is one that every American should know and remember.